welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Library. My name is Barney Levantino. I am a reference librarian here, and I'm happy today to welcome MP Woodward, Mike Woodward. Mike, welcome.
Hey, Barney. Good to be here.
I'm happy to have you. Mike, your newest book is Dead Drop, which is the second in the Meredith and John Dale series. And tell us briefly about Dead Drop, and then we're going to get into the whole series as well.
Sure. Yeah. Dead Drop focuses on the Iran conflict, and it looks at a world where the Iranians have actually now obtained the ability to build a nuclear warhead. And if you actually this week in The Economist, there's an article that says that that's about where we are. And in the intelligence community, they call that breakout. And so in a world where Iran has already done that, that shifts the strategy for everyone involved from one of, let's try to sabotage these facilities to how do we handle that? Where do we need to worry, et cetera. And in Dead Drop, the Americans take a point of view that they can manage this diplomatically, but the Israelis just get some evidence in the form of an unexploded missile that suggests that the Iranians are up to something else. The Israelis disagree with the approach, and it pits Mossad against CIA in conflict because of a disagreement on how to handle this.
This book, it was really interesting, and I confess that I had not been familiar with the prior book, and I don't generally like picking up series in the middle. So as I was halfway into this, I said, you know what, I got to stop. I went back, I picked up book one, which was The Handler, and I learned more of the backstory. It's not necessary for readers if you haven't gotten book one, but by all means, I recommend both. And reading The Handler first kind of put it in perspective. I learned a little bit more about the relationships between your main characters, your protagonists, Meredith and John, who are ex-spouses, but also both employed by CIA. Well, John at the time no longer is. He kind of is something of a reluctant hero in both of these books. And how did those two characters develop? How'd you come up with the concept of husband and wife team, a handler, an asset, an agent in place? Where'd that come from?
When I first started thinking about this series, it was 2020, and the Iranians had accidentally shot down an airliner, a civilian airliner, and they'd done it at a time of high tensions with the U.S. It was in January of 2020, and that is actually the prologue in the Handler, which you read, so you know. And I started to think, wow, what if somebody important had been on that plane, or if somebody that was a relative of someone important had been on that plane, and that's what set that drama in motion. And then as I started thinking about how could I build tension, I first thought of, who would the villains be? What would be the key thing that a hero would need to get? And then as I thought about the heroes, I think one of the struggles in a book like this is you say to yourself, okay, is this the kind of thing where that person has access, to the president, right? And we see that sometimes, like Mitch Rapp and Vince Flynn's series had access to the president. And I never thought that was realistic. And so I thought, how can I create something where you see what's going on behind the scenes and you get some of that, John le Carré sort of spy strategy stuff, but the current market for intelligence thrillers and espionage thrillers tends to involve more action and more things on people on the ground. And so I came up with the idea that, well, if there were, and I should mention, in doing my research for that, as I was thinking about heroes, I read a number of CIA people's memoirs and also Iranian spies' memoirs, all kinds of stuff out there. And I came to see that there were a number of CIA people who were married to each other. And the marriages were always under tremendous tension. And so on the one hand, they're often drawn together because it's a very cloistered society. And it's only natural that in a world where they operate in secret, that only certain people know what they're doing. And so you can see where people like that would get together. On the other hand, a lot of those marriages fail because of the pressure. So when I read a book like that, I thought, okay, that's it. I can have one of them be in the agency and the other one be disaffected, and one of them be a person that was high enough at the strategy level to be able to inform the big picture, but still have somebody on the ground. And then I thought it'd be really fun if one handled the other, because there's just natural conflict in a relationship between ex-spouses.
You're ratcheting up between the everyday conflict between husband and wife and the conflict between agent and handler, and it really puts a lot of strain, I guess, on Meredith and John's relationship. These books, you mentioned the current trend in popular espionage fiction is a lot of action versus the old school Jean le Carré. These books really touch on both, and I guess it's a function of how you structured it, with Meredith being behind the scenes, formulating plans, running operations, and John out in the field. So you get a little bit of both in these, and it was a good read. Both of the books were actually good reads, and your mechanism, to my mind, from working from the downed airliner, really ratcheted up the twists in the story, the obvious connection that you would think would come up, and you ended up like 5, 6, 7 people down the line who become really the focus of the operation. It's not as overt and as obvious to the reader really where it was going. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and thank you. And you're pointing out some things that I thought a lot about mechanically. One of which is, to have multiple perspectives so that you can inform a story as well as drive it forward. So a lot of times, what I try to do is you have action, and that can be hopefully a satisfying scene and an entertaining scene. And then when you cut away, you could be a week or two ahead, and the other characters are reacting to the result of that action. And in kind of skipping between those different perspectives, it's almost like a bank shot, right? You're constantly indirectly giving the reader an eye on what's happening. And so I think a lot about that. And I also think a lot about how and when to present enough information to the reader so that they certainly know what's going on, but you don't spill everything that's going to happen. Right. And so that's something that I keep trying to get better at, but I think is important in these kinds of novels.
What also came across is the primary characters and the movers in the books are all kind of approaching this from several different perspectives, from their own particular sphere of influence, if you would, and their own particular agenda. You have the tension between the diplomatic corps, the State Department, and the operations people over in CIA. And in certain respects, you have the diplomats almost undermining what's going on out in the field, and the field people racing to try to do what they need to do before the diplomats come in and, in their view, screw everything up. So it's kind of an interesting tension going on there. Also, as between different agencies between the countries, between the U.S. and Israel and the Iranians, it's just a lot of interplay going on there. It's really fascinating to see the interactions.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're pointing out two things that I would like to say that hey, these are great ideas, but in a way they're the only way I knew how to do it. Each one of those characters that brings a perspective, I wanted them to all feel like they're kind of like actual people, not just like an evil guy or whatever. And so that meant that they all have to have kind of their own arc, which means that they all have their own objective and challenge that they're trying to solve. So I wanted their motivations to be something that anybody reading this could say, "Oh, I've met a guy like that at work," or "Oh, I could see why that would be the case." And when it came to that State Department CIA thing, I used in Dead Drop, I used a device which is a real world thing called a national intelligence estimate. And when the American policymakers are going to make a big national security decision, they actually go and do form a thing called a national intelligence estimate, or an NIE, and you can read them. They're out there on the web. They get sanitized, but the conclusions get made, and it is a real world thing that the last arbiter of that NIE is the CIA, and their clandestine service is supposed to go out and kind of say that, like, yep, we've checked out these sources, et cetera. We agree or don't, and endorse it or not endorse it. And so I gave Meredith that job, and certainly the State Department is on the other side saying, come on, we have a really good deal here. It was very hard to do, hard to put together. I've had to balance a million things. They are committed professionals. They think it's the right thing. They don't want to hear a fly in the soup that, hey, oh no, turns out we might be mistaken. And so that, to me, that tension would be somewhat natural.
Your own personal background is also kind of interesting. You were in naval intelligence back in the day. And from there, you went into the entertainment industry. I guess you worked for Amazon for a bit. And how does that transition happen to you from naval intelligence to novelist? Is it something that you had in your mind way back when, or did it just kind of evolve? And I ask the question because I've spoken to recently a number of authors who also come from that background. Either they were military guys in intelligence or in some other alphabet organization, and they made the transition eventually to writing books in this kind of broad genre. So how did you end up here?
My personal journey is that I wanted to be a writer first before any of those things. Ever since I was a little kid, I think I read Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island, in seventh grade, and immediately tried to write a pirate novel. And then I read the Hornblower series and had sort of the same romantic notions. And then later, it starts to be like, well, that's not realistic, but it's something that I dreamt about quite a bit and thought about and never stopped thinking about. I went into the Navy and ended up as an intelligence officer, and then lo and behold, several years into my career there, one of the jobs I had was to work for the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. It's called U.S. Commander-in-Chief Pacific, or CINCPAC. And my job he's a 4-star admiral, and my job at that time was to write the war games and create the war games for the Pacific. And this was, around 1998 or so. And one of them was Taiwan. We were in the Taiwan Straits. China was shooting missiles into the Taiwan Straits then. A lot of them had to do with civilian catastrophes, like, well, what would we do to evacuate trapped Americans in a tsunami, things of that nature, or how would we provide medical relief in Pakistan if something big happened. And it got me acquainted with all the different types of, all the different commands around the Pacific, as well as all of our intelligence, basically at a national level. And so I was working with the 17 intelligence agencies, writing these stories and creating the message traffic and everything else. And, as somebody who'd always dreamt of being a novelist, it was a really fun job. And I it was one of those things I just loved
I loved doing it. Nobody knew that I, cared about telling stories, but I did. And then later, when I had a long tech career because, like anybody else, I wanted to make money, and I ended up at Amazon and Amazon Prime Video, and I ended up rubbing shoulders just as part of distribution of video, the business side of that, rubbing shoulders with producers and directors and those kinds of guys, and hearing them talk about stories and pulling them together, hearing them create content right in front of me really kind of sparked it for me. Like, hey, you know what? I know something about this stuff. I know how now I kind of can see how stories might come together. Why don't I give this a go? And then I did in 2020, and that was The Handler.
Which was, as I said, a fun introduction to Meredith and John. While we're talking about Amazon Video and we're talking about Meredith and John, any potential for bringing them to a screen, either small or large?
Yeah, well, I the way that works is that there are agents that do book. There are, you have literary agents. They have relationships with other agents who do book to screen. And so I have a book to screen agent, and then that person introduces you to all kinds of other guys. And so, yeah, I've had lots of those conversations. The world of getting something from a book to screen is very torturous. And so, those are always really fun conversations, but I tend to keep my expectations low. I would certainly love to see it for sure.
Well, the characters are interesting. I think there would be a lot of fun on screen. But John in particular, I think I referred to him earlier on as a reluctant hero. He kind of gets drawn back in after incidents that happened prior to The Handler. And we won't go into the specifics. I don't want to be a spoiler here, but he gets drawn back in, and he's clearly a patriot, and he's clearly got the best interests of his country first and foremost in his mind. And oftentimes he gets referred to, and these agents out in place, they get referred to as assets. And in these books, the higher ups kind of quickly flip it from he's an asset to a liability, and he kind of gets tossed out. And you can see where he's coming from and where his ambivalence comes to the fore in being asked to come back in. And that was an interesting aspect of it. And how did you kind of develop that part of John's character?
Oh yeah, good question. I read a number of memoirs and actually interviewed a guy. I guess I probably shouldn't say his name or anything, but a guy that had been senior in what they used to call the Special Activities Division. Now they call it the Special Activities Center. But there's a certain class mentality, I think, between the seventh floor types in effectively management and the guys who are carrying guns around and they call them knuckle draggers. And if you saw the movie 13 Hours, for example, you see some of that, right? And that, granted, those were hired security guys, but you still see that attitude. And I don't mean that as a disparagement of the agency, but I thought it would be an interesting thing to highlight. And I do think that John has this flaw where, yes, he is a patriot, but he also feels like, hey, I've done my duty. I kind of want to just be left alone at this point. And it's hard. It's like, well, you have special relationships that other people don't necessarily have in both directions. And so if you're truly a patriot, we kind of need you here, and that's what happens to him. And so he wrestles with whether he wants to do that or not. And is it the right thing or not? But I did not. So that was where that came from. But one thing that I did feel strongly about is having worked with a number of intelligence people from all these different agencies is they were all patriots. And I'm not the guy to write a book where, it turns out the director all along was a Chinese agent, stuff like that, because I don't
there are bad guys out there. You know, we've captured moles within the CIA, and they can be a villain. But I didn't want to make the CIA villainous. You know, I wanted it to be. It is a hard job, and people are going to get jaded. That's what I wanted John to represent.
Yeah, I don't see villainy there. I see conflict between, as you call them, the seventh floor people who are essentially political animals,
Right.
versus the people down on the ground who are operating more in the real world versus
Right.
the abstract of the politics involved. But you think back to Michael Corleone. Just when you think he's out, he gets dragged back in, and that seems to be what happened to John. And again, his relationship with Meredith also plays into that. And as much as they refer to each other as exes, there's clearly something still between them.
And I wanted to play up that idea too, that, you know, that bond is bigger than just, you know, professional or ex, right? And that John does it not only has a duty to his country, but he has a duty, you know, to somebody that he loves. He may not love her the way that he once did, but he's still the mother of his child.
There is one character that I have to bring up, and that's Ed Rance, who is, again, motivated by, I think, love of country. He kind of went a little bit astray in The Handler. And one thing that I found, these books are really very close timeline-wise. They happen really within months of each other. And Ed's problems in book one, and I question how he landed quite so easily on his feet in book two. And I wonder whether, you know, the reality would have been a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, in how to answer that, my editor said, I want him in book two.
Okay.
First of all. And there are definitely times when you have to ignore certain realities, right? But I remember when I was writing book two, going into a kind of a lengthy-ish explanation as to why it was okay. I can't even remember what it was now, but it hit the cutting room floor because it took you so far out of the narrative. I was like, this is boring. You know what I mean? And my editor also felt strongly that book two needed to stand on its own. So I didn't want to get in the position where I was litigating what had happened in book one in book two. And it, by the way, it didn't read well when I tried to do that. So at some point you just kind of have to make a decision like, you know what, I'm going to take this needs to be a good story. Not everything's perfect, right? So you have to suspend disbelief a bit there. Yeah,
no, not a criticism. And actually your editor is right. I think you definitely did need Ed in the book and in book two.
Yeah.
He plays a significant role. And it was just, as I said, I'm thinking, he kind of got into a little bit of a pickle in the first scenario, and he landed on his feet, as we said, and he'll be okay. I guess he'll be in book three as well.
Well, I mean, one thing is that I did, now it's coming back to me as the way I had thought about it, is that he did get manipulated in the first book, but he was also the target of a, you know, an elite espionage squad. So he was something of a victim in a way, right? And so what I did have as an explanation was that, yes, he had been, okay, now it's all coming back to me. He was cleared of any intentional wrongdoing. And then in book two, what you'll notice is he's not on the seventh floor. He's been kind of exiled, right? So he's in a foreign embassy again, which for him, he's like, man, you know, this is a job I should have had 2 jobs ago. And it was a little bit of like, you got to get back to the kids' table. And that's why he's so motivated in Dead Drop to find a route back to where he's very important again. And that's why he does what he does to get as close as he does to, you know, to those Iranian agents and things like that, to be the guy, right? He says he sees that as an important career step.
And again, not to disclose any spoilers here, but at the end of Dead Drop, John has a decision to make, and which I guess will lead us into book 3. And you're working on that, and you got some ideas for that already?
I just finished it actually, and it should be out. There's a lag in publishing, so you finish it and give it to your editor a year before it comes out. So it'll come out next May. And one of the things I wanted to do with this series is, if in a classic sense, Meredith is the hero of book 1 because it starts with her and ends with her. In book 2. In book 3, it's really 70-30 on John. He's more the hero of that book in the literary sense.
Well, I'm going to look forward to that one, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you next spring after book 3 comes out. Meanwhile, for our listeners, the newest book is Dead Drop by MP Woodward. Prior to that is The Handler. I recommend both very highly. You can pick them up here at the library. And Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. The books are fascinating. It's been great talking to you, and I'm going to look forward to book 3.
Awesome, Barney. Thank you. I love being here.
Thank you very much. And we will, at this point, turn the page on this chapter of our podcast. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and look for us down the road.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.